Good morning. Coming to you from the wood shop today. And yesterday we ended at verse 50 of Matthew chapter 27 with Jesus breathing his last. It's the Good Friday, and today as we read, what happened in the moments after that, in just the next little bit of time. The first thing we see in verse 51, it says that at that moment, as Jesus breathed his last, at that moment, the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. And I think that's significant, and other people do too. I mean, we've learned this from seminary professors and thinking, the curtain was torn from top to bottom. If it had been torn by human origin, it most likely would have been from bottom to top. And how do they know top to bottom? I'm not going to wonder about that, but with the curtain being torn from top to bottom, from heaven down to earth, it's significant. I think that God is saying that, it's no longer necessary for the high priest to go behind this curtain. This is what it was. The curtain separated the temple from God, or the people from God. And so with this curtain torn, it was like, God is saying, there is no longer this veil between us. I'm right here. You can come to me. You don't have to come through the high priest. You don't have to do all of this. It's heaven has been opened that way. And then another in Matthew, some stuff we don't really hear or talk about too much. It says that at that moment also the earth shook, the rocks were split. We hear about an earthquake and the rock splitting, but often, as the stone was rolled away on Sunday morning, we hear that a little bit sometimes, but the earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So this is, as Jesus died on the cross, Matthew tells us that many people who were saints, who were believers in Jesus, who were revered by their community, were raised from the dead. And this is something that we don't really hear much about or talk much about. And then it says, verse 53, after Jesus' resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. So these saints that were released from the bonds of death, came and were witnesses, of that. And again, we don't really talk too much about that. We don't hear too much about that. With verse 54, we do. It says, now the centurion and those with him were keeping, saw the earthquake. They saw what took place, says they were terrified. And the centurion says, truly, this man was God's son. So here we have one of the Roman soldiers who would have really no reason to believe that Jesus would be God's son. But when he sees what happens at Jesus' death, out on the hill where Jesus was crucified wasn't far from the tombs. And these people saw what happened and they realized it. And this man says, truly, this was God's son. And then we find out now in Matthew that, even though Matthew says they all fell away, they all deserted him, it says that many of the women were there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and provided for him. It was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John that way. So there were, these women were faithful and they were there. And, they weren't the only witnesses to the death of Jesus on the cross. We read in John's gospel, it says that John was there, and there are discrepancies in this narrative of what happened there and that's normal. I don't think we have to worry a lot about the little bit of differences. You think about the stories of Jesus told by the different gospel writers and told by the different writers of the books in the New Testament. It only makes sense that there are various, a little bit of variety in how they were told, because, as I remember a certain thing that happened, I might remember something a little bit more one day than I do the day before, and so the stories are different. But there were people there that were witnesses. And it says now that, Jesus had breathed his last in verse 50, where we ended yesterday. And now it says, that Jesus hung there for a while because, it says when it was evening, it was dark from noon till 3 o'clock. And Jesus spoke some, but when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. And Joseph, it says, was a disciple of Jesus, but he was also on the council. He was one of the Sanhedrin. He was one of the religious leaders, this Joseph of Arimathea. And he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate ordered that it would be given to him. And now this is something that, in my footnotes and in different things I've read, it says that, the people that were crucified, that were put to death in that manner, that were executed, were often denied burial. Their bodies would be, taken out to the wilderness or whatever. If someone was executed that way, often they weren't allowed, to be buried, or they would, worse things that would happen, they would remain there on that cross, until, there was nothing left. It's just terrible things to think about. But Joseph came, this member of the Sanhedrin, one of the religious leaders, and he came and he asked Pilate for the body. And Pilate said, yeah, you may have it. He ordered it to be given to him. So it says Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb. And then he rolled this great stone in front of the door. And it says that, the very last thing that we read today, well, no, it isn't either, but in verse 61, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. And again, it's a reminder that some were faithful. And think about, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, very possibly Jesus' mother, the other Mary, watching as her son is taken down from the cross and buried. And I've talked with mothers and fathers, and I've witnessed my own mother and father as their child died and was buried, and the pain and the anguish that is there, and I know firsthand the hurt, the reality of a parent losing a child is not what it should be. But they were faithful, they were watching. And I'm sure they were filled with sorrow. And how could they hang on? How could they grasp or even come close to understanding the words that Jesus had told them that he would rise again? The last part of what we read today, verses 62 to 66, says the next day, the day after preparation, on the Sabbath is they can't do anything, and everything that way. But the next day, the chief priests and the Pharisees come to Pilate and they say, we remember that this Jesus said that, he was going to rise again. So we need you to set a guard on that tomb so that Jesus' followers don't just come and roll the stone away and take his body and say, he came back to life. We got to, he said it'd be 3 days, so we got to have a guard there, and it's up to you to provide that guard. And so they say to him, therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. And then the religious leaders say this: the last deception would be worse than the first. They're saying that the resurrection of Jesus would be the deception that would be even greater than Jesus saying that I am the Son of God, even greater than Jesus saying I am the Messiah. That if his disciples did in fact just come and steal the body, that would be a great deception. And it would be. Had the disciples simply come and stole the body of Jesus and made the claim, unfounded, that Jesus had been raised from the dead, it would have been a great deception if people were to believe it. But the reality is that Jesus was raised from the dead by the power of God. And over the next 50 days after that, we're not at the resurrection yet today, but in our reading anyway, but Jesus lived and talked and walked among the people for many days after his resurrection. So even though the religious leaders had gone and asked Pilate to set this guard And in our minds and in some of the other Gospels, we'll hear that the Romans that were standing guard, Pilate says to them here in Matthew, he says, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go and make it as secure as you can." So evidently these religious leaders had a guard of soldiers, whether they were the Roman soldiers or whether they were the temple police. I mean, it's not real specific here. But, you know, and in my footnote it says you have a guard, it's permission to use the temple police. But yet, and the temple police were under the Sanhedrin, and maybe if he had said, you know, take a guard, you know, you have a guard of soldiers. So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure. So I can see it both ways, that they're using the temple police to guard the tomb, or that Pilate gave them a platoon or some soldiers to do the guarding. You know, that, you know, maybe he had a squad of Roman soldiers or a handful of them. It's not completely clear to me in Matthew's gospel at this point as to who is guarding the tomb, but what is clear is that the religious leaders feared that what Jesus had said may be true. They feared that Jesus may rise from the dead. What they feared even more than that was that the disciples, the followers, would go and take the body and just make a false claim. I guess we can't get too far ahead of ourselves right now as we're just reading through this. But what is one of your greatest fears? I mean, what would you do? I mean, how do you address your fears? I mean, and so here the church leaders, fearing that Jesus may indeed be the Messiah, fearing whatever may happen, do whatever it is to protect themselves. And that's what we do when we fear something. We try to protect ourselves. And in the Bible, it tells us 365, 366, 367 times, depending on who does the counting, have no fear or be not afraid. And so the fear that these Pharisees, these religious leaders have that the disciples will come and steal the body away is unfounded. Because the reality is that Jesus is raised from the dead by the power of God. And again, we're not to that point yet. We'll get to that tomorrow as we read in Matthew 28. May God walk with you today as he does every day.